Right, with that, please let me welcome you to this session of Taylor and Francis's 2022 Researcher webinar series, now coming to a close for this year. My name is Vicky Jewell. I'd like to thank you all for joining us here today. Alongside me here is our speaker for today's session, Didi Peng. Didi is a Research Integrity Manager within the Publishing Ethics and Integrity Department. Their team is responsible for providing specialist advice and support on ethical, research integrity and policy matters. Didi's work focuses on the overarching aim of minimizing risk and ensuring compliance to the highest publication ethics standards across Taylor and Francis journals. And this session today will provide an introduction to publishing ethics, including an overview of the common types of issues which can arise. We will discuss the role that publishers and editors play in ensuring the integrity of the scholarly record and what authors need to know in order to avoid problems. The session will also provide an overview on when, why, and how we might issue a retraction notice, a correction notice, or an expression of concern notice. The responsibility of authors will be discussed, as well as tips on how to prevent problems from arising on submissions. We aim to help you spot potential ethics issues before they affect your work, how to navigate them, and maximise your publishing experience by successfully working your way through these aspects of academic publishing. Please can I remind you all at this point that the talk is being recorded and a video will be made available after the event. The slides can be found in the handout section of the platform interface. So again, the grey box normally found on your right. You should see handouts. There's an option there. It's normally a drop down. You can expand that out and you'll see two files in there, both the slides that Didi is going to be using and also a quick page of resources that you can use as well. If you click on those, they'll open in your browser, and from there you should be able to download them. So please make the most of those and use them during while the webinar is live, as they won't be available afterwards. That said, if you email me, I can always send them. On a quick note about accessibility, please do raise your hand if you have any accessibility requirements, and I'll message you directly and see what we can do. We're looking into what further support we can provide live. Obviously, we are somewhat limited live. And I also appreciate that for many people on the call, English is not their first language. Thank you for joining us, and I can only apologise that my linguistics are not able to meet you on your language. Please do note that, as I mentioned, the talks are recorded and made available to registrants after the webinar. So if you miss anything, that is there to support you. And if you have any technical problems during the talk, again, raise your hand and I'll do my best to message you directly and help. Though please note that many of GoToWebinar's technical issues can usually be solved by exiting and reloading the talk. So please try that if you're having trouble. Do put all of your comments and questions in the question bar. Again, that's normally in that panel to your right. And at the end of the talk, I'll be posing them to Didi for her insight. Feel free to send in those comments as we go. I'll return to them all at the end. And do bear in mind that it's difficult for us to speak to very specific scenarios unless it's something that you think a lot of other people have experienced as well. We'll do our best to answer as much as possible for you in around 15 minutes at the end of the presentation. If your question isn't answered, or it's a very specific query, or if you'd just be more comfortable contacting us via email rather than live, please send your messages to my email address, which is in the chat there, or rdo@tnf.co.uk, which is also listed in the resources document. And I believe that Didi's email address is also available on the last slide if you'd like to ask your questions to her directly. There's also a survey that will pop up at the end of the talk. If I can encourage you to fill that in as much as possible, it helps us build these sessions for next year. And finally, if you're interested in any of our other talks for the remainder of the year, please check out the events listing on Taylor & Francis's Author Services website. That's also, there's a link to that in the links and resources handout. So I think that is probably enough from me. And I will now hand over to Didi to begin today's talk on publishing ethics. Thank you, Didi.
Thank you, Vicky, and hello everyone. Nice to meet you. I'm Lydie, as Vicky said. I'm a Research Integrity Manager in the Taylor & Francis Publishing Ethics and Integrity team here at Taylor & Francis, and I'm really happy to be here today to talk to you about ethics and integrity in scholarly publishing. So I'm going to go over to the next slide. Vicky, could you just confirm that you can see the next slide?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, great. So the webinar will be covering today an introduction to publication ethics. So who guides this, the common issues that we see, and we'll then focus in on the ethics of authorship, some key declarations and publishing practices, which are all detailed within our journal editorial policies. And then we'll move on to look at what options there are to us as the publishers in terms of ensuring the integrity of the scholarly record. This is mainly done through post-publication notices, so some of these you may have already come across, corrections, expressions of concern, and retractions. And then we'll end with some tips on avoiding some ethical problems and questions. So that's the outline for today's webinar. I'm now going to be turning off my webcam just so that we can focus in on the rest of the presentation. Thank you. So before we go into what is publication ethics, I'd like to look at the broader question of what we mean by scholarly publishing. So here you'll see a definition of scholarly publishing from the Association of College and Research Libraries. And I've included this because I think it sums up nicely the purpose of a publisher of peer-reviewed journals. That is, we as publishers, collectively with our journal editors, are responsible for the evaluation of quality, the dissemination of the information to the scholarly community, and the preservation of the scholarly record for all future research. And all of this relies on the adherence to the highest publication ethics standards. So what is publication ethics? Publication ethics is a system of professional conduct standards, and this is in relations between authors, reviewers, editors, publishers, and readers when creating, disseminating, and using scholarly publications. It's based and formed by consensus about the standards and best practice to ensure integrity of the scholarly record, which means that readers can trust what they read, which in turn ensures scholars and researchers can build upon published work. And when it comes to who guides publication ethics, there are various bodies who are involved in ensuring what best practice processes look like and agreeing to those standards. We as a publisher are one of those bodies, but as you can see, there are many others on this slide, including ethics bodies and different scholarly societies that we work with. So it's really very much a collective effort. One of the most prominent ethics bodies is COPE, which is the Committee on Publication Ethics, and some of you may already be familiar with them. COPE is involved in guiding publication ethics as they provide a lot of the industry standard guidance, educational resources, and flowcharts. And as such, a lot of the criteria and processes that we follow for things like retractions and how to handle different ethical concerns are in line with COPE guidance. So let's now move on to look at what are the common types of ethical issues that we see at Taylor & Francis. On this slide, you can see a range of common issues or new trends that we're seeing across our journals, and this very much reflects what's been experienced across the publishing industry. We won't have time, unfortunately, to cover all of these today, but I did want to go into some of these in more detail a bit later. Some of the issues we see are due to a lack of full understanding or training around standards and acceptable practices, or it could be due to honest error, but we're also seeing an increasing trend related to issues around deliberate and systematic manipulation of the publication process. For example, data or image manipulation or fabrication and paper mills. In some complex cases, it can involve a multiple number of these issues. So it could be authorship dispute combined with data manipulation concerns. And the investigation process often involves multiple parties. So it's not just an author we're dealing with. So as a publisher, we may, for example, start off an investigation into a concern, but then later on the author's institutions will need to be contacted before we can move on to the next step. So some of these issues can take considerable time and resources to resolve. So this is why it's really important that we try and prevent these kinds of problems from coming up in the first place. And this is where our editorial policies play a key role. They detail from the outset what we expect from authors in terms of adhering to publishing ethics standards and what can happen in cases where these standards haven't been met or where misconduct has been confirmed. So one of the key issues we cover in our editorial policies is the responsibility of authorship. So this here you can see is a definition or the criteria that we apply to authorship and takes into account the publishing ethics requirements of authors. As you can see, the first point states that anyone listed as an author must have made a significant contribution to the work. They must also have contributed to the writing or revising of the article. Essentially, they need to have at least critically reviewed the article because they're agreeing to the content within it. They must also have agreed on the journal which the article is being submitted to, and this is to avoid duplicate submission. And then as the article goes from submission through to when it gets published, the article will have evolved or changed according to revisions or comments from the reviewers and editors. So any listed authors must also have reviewed and agreed on all those different versions. And all of this is because of the final point, which is really important. So it does in that all authors listed collectively take responsibility and each of them are accountable for the contents of the article. So it doesn't matter if they're listed as the first author or the last author or any of the authors in between. Each and every one of those authors are collectively responsible should any questions come up later about the accuracy of or the integrity of the published work. It's important to remember also that anyone that meets the authorship criteria, as you can see here, it should be listed as an author. So don't miss anybody off. And it's also important to note that authorship comes with responsibilities in that the corresponding author signs an author publishing agreement once an article is accepted for publication on behalf of all authors. And this is a legal agreement which has various declarations around the integrity of the content, the originality, the fact that there's been no breach of copyright, and so on. So as the corresponding author signs this agreement on behalf of all of the authors, that's why it's really important that there is integrity in the authorship of the papers right from the start. So now we're looking at acknowledgements, and this is an area which can be easily overlooked when you're considering authorship. This is because as an author, you might tend to think that including someone within the acknowledgements is a nice thing to do because you're saying thank you to them, to the people that have contributed to the article, but that may not necessarily fit the criteria for authorship. And whilst this is true, it is a kind and ethical thing to do. It is equally important that as an author, you notify the person that you're acknowledging and obtain their permission to include their name in the article. This is because sometimes that person being acknowledged might not want to be named, and there are various reasons for this. It could be for personal reasons, sometimes it's for political reasons, and it can also be that the person doesn't agree with the interpretations or the findings of the article and therefore may not want to be associated with it. However, more often the real reason, or the reason that comes up most often, is that the people believe that they should be listed as an author rather than being acknowledged. And so then this leads on to what's known as an authorship dispute. To help mitigate this, we have a question in our online submission portal asking authors to declare that they have got permission from the person or the persons being named in the acknowledgements. And this is there to try and prevent some of the problems further down the line. And so one of these problems, as I mentioned earlier, is an authorship dispute. And this is where one or more authors disagree on something. So it could be the author list, or someone has contacted us to say they should have been listed as an author, or the other way around, they should not have been listed as an author. Whatever the dispute, it's important to note that we as the publisher or the journal editor can't resolve these kinds of disputes by ourselves. As often it's one person's word against another, and in these cases we would have to raise this with the author's institution because only they would have access to the information or evidence needed to make an informed decision, and it's also their responsibility as well, as the authors are based there. So if the article has not been published yet, then if we're looking into an authorship dispute, all processes would at that time be placed on hold, and we would inform the authors that we can only proceed once all the authors, including any that are being added or removed, can come to a consensus or agreement on what the correct authorship list should be. If the authors can't agree, then we would advise that we would need the institution to investigate and then ask them to update us when they've reached a consensus. And only at that point we can proceed with any changes. So best practice is to ensure, as authors, there is agreement on any proposed changes before making a request to the journal. And I'll come back to this point later. Gift authorship is another authorship issue that we can come across. And this is where someone is added as an author, but they have not made any real contribution to the work. Often this is for some kind of hierarchy or political reasons. So maybe the person being added is a head of department or someone prominent that the authors feel will make their work more favourable to being accepted by the journal. What's most problematic here is when the person who's being gifted the authorship is not aware of this. And so they've not been notified or informed that their name is being added to the authorship list. And so they then become responsible for something that they never agreed to. Then there's the opposite case, which is ghost authorship. As the name suggests, this is where someone who has made a real contribution to the work and who meets the criteria for authorship has been left off the authorship list. So they don't receive the credit for their work. What's most concerning in this case is where the person has deliberately not listed themselves as an author. And this is because they might have a very strong competing interest with the results reported in the paper. Often in such cases, we see there is some kind of link with industry or a commercial company, and the paper is on testing of some kind of product or device, and the results are very positive. This person or group of people may have had direct involvement in the analysing of the data and forming the conclusions, but they intentionally do not list themselves as an author because they do not want to declare the competing interest. As you'll probably understand, this is a very serious problem because it's then hidden from the editor and reviewers, and so the work does not receive a fair assessment, and any potential bias or influence over the research findings and conclusions are then concealed from the readers. Then we have authorship for sale, which is really the basis for how paper mills operate. For those of you who haven't come across the term before, paper mills are profit-oriented, unofficial organisations that produce and sell fraudulent manuscripts that look like genuine research. They often handle the administration for submitting the work to journals, and they sell the authorships to the researchers once they know that the article is going to be accepted for publication. However, aside from the wide-scale problem of paper mills, authorship for sale is still a concern at a much more smaller scale, because it can happen, for instance, between colleagues who will charge another colleague for a large fee for adding them onto a paper that they know is going to be published. In our investigations, we find when we're looking at these types of cases is that the manuscript themselves are also problematic, often containing fake data or stock images and avoidable waste and redundancy in the literature. And so what are the kind of impacts of this? Well, the problems are that it harms journals and it harms scholarly work, because it leads to the publication of dishonest and unreliable work and avoidable waste and redundancy in the literature. It also damages the reputation of the authors and the institutions involved. And this is why we need to be really careful when it comes to requests for authorship changes, particularly when there are a large number of them. And so this is the reason, or partly the reason, for the below policy for changes to the authorship list, which is stated in our editorial policy on authorship. Our journals require the completion of an authorship change form before making any changes to the authorship list on articles post-acceptance. So whether it's to add or remove authors, we ask authors to fill in one of these forms, which requires an author to provide the original list of authors, the new list of authors, and to detail the reasons for why someone is being added or removed. And then each of the authors, including those being added or removed, provide their agreement through a written signature. The completed form is then reviewed by the journal editor, and only then, when there is agreement with those proposed changes, it can go ahead. So this process ensures that we have consensus and confirmations from each listed author on any changes to the authorship, and it also allows us to detect and address any authorship disputes and related problems earlier on. So let's now take a look at competing interests, also known as conflict of interests. And as I said, this can often link into authorship issues such as ghost authorship. So a competing interest, we know that anyone can really potentially have a competing interest. So we understand that many researchers wear multiple hats and have different roles, and this is quite common across the industry. When it comes to disclosing competing interests, often authors tend to think that it's about financial competing interests. However, as stated in our editorial policy, as you can see on this slide, the non-financial competing interest examples are just as important. So a competing interest can include voluntary as well as paid employment. It could be a competing interest because the person would benefit in some way from the development of the product or the service that the article is discussing. And it could be for non-financial reasons. So it could be for personal or ideological reasons, or because the person is involved in legal action related to the work. So all of these need to be declared on submission. Also, we emphasize in our editorial policy that it can be a perceived competing interest, as often authors themselves state that they didn't declare anything because there is no competing interest in their view. However, it's the reader's perception here that is key, and ensuring full transparency. So declaring a competing interest does not mean that the paper will not be published. However, not declaring a relevant and competing interest can lead to complications and problems later. So the key point here is about ensuring transparency, and if there is any doubt on whether something is or is not a competing interest, our advice is that it's always better to declare it on submission, or at least check this with the journal editor. So another issue we see is consent to publish. Consent to publish concerns can appear where the content of the article includes information that can potentially identify someone. So any type of content that includes information about a person, and this could be a patient or a study participant, or an interviewee, which is providing information at such a level that someone can reasonably identify themselves, or someone who knows that person could identify them, requires authors to get consent to publish. And this protects against any possible violation of privacy claims. So this means authors need to inform that person or their parent or legal guardian or next of kin if they're not able to give the consent themselves, and ask them to provide that consent. Authors need to declare they have secured this consent and who granted the consent on submission. Many institutions have their own forms for this kind of thing, but if not, we have on our website, again in our editorial policies, you can see this, a consent to publish form which authors can use, and you can see this on the slide here. So this form is freely available online and explains that not just the fact that the individual could potentially be identified, but also explains that readers of the published article may include a wide variety of people. So not just the typical readership of the journal, but it can be picked up by members of the public as well. Authors should save a copy of this signed consent form. We don't, as journals, routinely ask to see copies of these forms, as we trust authors have got this where they have declared it. However, in some cases, for example, if we're doing an ethics investigation, the journal may decide that it would like to request to see a copy of the form. And because it contains sensitive information such as people's signatures and names, we always ensure it's stored securely, it's not shared with anyone that doesn't need to see it, and then it's destroyed when we no longer need it. So whilst it's widely known that you shouldn't submit your manuscript to more than one journal at the same time, we do still see quite a lot of duplicate submissions and publications. So authors are asked to declare on submission that the work that they're submitting to the journal is original and that it hasn't been submitted elsewhere for publication. And they are also asked to confirm this when they sign the author publishing agreement before publication. So we do what we can to try and help prevent these issues by prompting authors and reminding them of the expectations. There are some instances where duplicate submission can be considered okay, and this could be where the article is considered important, but it was published in another language. So for example, in a national journal. And in order to disseminate the work more widely, the author may want to translate it and publish it in an international journal. Whether or not to consider this is at the editor's discretion. If the editor of the journal feels that it might be an important addition to the journal content and the readership and so on, and there is justification for a secondary publication, then there are some things to consider before proceeding. In these cases, it needs to be clear that it is a translation and cannot be presented as a new piece of work. It should also cite the original version, so it's very clear to readers about the source. And before all of that, the authors also need to check with the original publisher or the copyright owner whether there are any restrictions or ways that they need to present this in terms of how it should be cited. So being clear about the fact that it is a translation is really important. Another case could be where it's a large consensus statement or guideline that involves large collaborations of scholars from that community. And they may decide that it needs to be disseminated as widely as possible, and so agree to co-publish it across several journals simultaneously. In this case, there are, again, considerations before doing this. So it requires prior agreement from all the journals, editors and publishers with full understanding of what that means. So there needs to be agreement about the peer review process. Who will be guiding that? How will the decisions be made? And what the publishing license will be when it's published, since it's going to be published across several different journals at the same time. Usually these end up as open access publications under what's known as a CC BY license, as the authors themselves are then the holders of that. Another case is presenting work or data in shorter forms at conferences is expected, and this is generally not considered duplicate publication. So authors do need to be careful in certain cases where it's conference proceedings which may be extended and might look like actual full papers. So in these cases, it will often require a judgment by the journal editor on whether it counts as duplicate publication or not. Also, if an earlier version of the paper has been posted in a repository or a preprint server, this is normally fine. We encourage this at Taylor & Francis and state in our preprint policy that depositing an article in a preprint server does not constitute duplicate publication. But again, as is the underlying theme for all of this, transparency is what's important here. So what we advise is that authors make it clear on submission, for example, in their cover letter, that an earlier version of the paper has been deposited as a preprint and provide the details of that earlier version. Plagiarism and text recycling is another top issue that we see for our journals. So I'm sure you're already quite familiar with what plagiarism is. Here we are defining plagiarism as the appropriation of another person's or group's ideas, processes, results, figures, or words without giving appropriate credit. So it's not just the plagiarism of words, it can be the plagiarism of ideas, figures, results, without giving appropriate credit. And it's that last bit which is key. And this can include content from books and websites and grey literature, not just from journal articles. For text plagiarism, we have good software to help us detect this. So some of you may have heard of Authenticate or Crossref Similarity Check. However, there are many forms of plagiarism, and a couple of the more common practices that we see, which are harder to detect using this software, there's two types. Firstly, mosaic plagiarism, which is where lots of little bits of text are taken from several different sources and put together to give the impression of a new piece of work. And often this is done without appropriate citations and references. And the second one is thesaurus plagiarism, where phrases are swapped out for words which mean the same thing, but the syntax or the structure of the phrasing or the sentences remain very similar. In any case of alleged plagiarism, we would always investigate the claims and give authors the right of a response to explain themselves. And we refer to our policy on plagiarism, which can be found on our editorial policies online. Where plagiarism has been confirmed, it is considered serious misconduct, and where the level of plagiarism is significant, it will almost always result in a rejection of the manuscript before acceptance, or in the case of a published article, the result will be a retraction. Text recycling, which can also sometimes be known as self-plagiarism, is where the similarity is with the author's own previous work, that they are excessively reusing and repeating. And the concern here is that if they're excessively reusing their own previous work, then what is it that's actually new about this piece of work? And things we're looking out for is it redundant publication, or is it salami slicing? The main problem with this is that it distorts the scholarly record because it gives the false impression that more work has been completed by that author than has actually been done. And this is considered unethical. And again, we would investigate all text recycling allegations as we would for all plagiarism concerns. Again, where it is at a significant level, this can lead to either a rejection of a manuscript in review or a retraction of the published article. However, it's broadly recognised that this is one of the more grey areas of plagiarism, since there are some occasions where overlap with your own previous work is for legitimate reasons, and we do recognise that. So in some cases, this does require a judgment call from the editor, and it's important where overlap does exist, you as an author are transparent about this at the point of submission and can justify why your work merits a separate publication. So in this slide, I'd like to briefly highlight the work of the Text Recycling Research Project. which some of you may be aware of, and it's something that TNF have been involved with as well. So the working group for this project has created a set of guidelines for researchers on what's okay and what's not okay in terms of text recycling. So Taylor and Francis are currently reviewing our editorial policies on plagiarism and text recycling in light of these guidelines, and we're aiming to provide more clear guidance to authors on what's acceptable and what's not in this area. So please do watch this space. Meanwhile, I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to look at the resources available on the Text Recycling Research Project website. So now moving on to image and data integrity. So image and data integrity is something which is becoming increasingly problematic, and this is partly because authors and agencies are now using far more sophisticated methods to manipulate or duplicate or fabricate data and images. As journals and publishers, we are more aware of these issues, and we are putting submissions under more scrutiny than before to try and catch these problems before they go out to peer review. To help us avoid some of these image and data issues and to let authors know what our expectations are in terms of image and data in manuscripts, we have this editorial policy on images and data, which can be found online. And at Taylor and Francis explains for science, technology, and medicine journals, any modifications are only acceptable if these are minor in nature and have been applied to the whole image. So where images have been modified or enhanced in any way, this must be stated with a full explanation within the manuscript, as well as the figure legend. And any modifications which can alter the scientific meaning or interpretation of the image are not allowed. An author should be prepared to share the original uncropped and unprocessed images with the journal editorial office upon request. And this is often when we're looking at ethics concerns in the paper. In some cases, though, it can be really tricky for us as the publisher to determine if there is data fabrication or manipulation, even where we have been provided the raw data files. In such cases, we would follow COPE guidance again and raise the concerns with the author's institution for investigation where we are in doubt. When it comes to specific considerations for images and data in our arts, humanities, and social sciences journals, it's more around the sensitivity of the images included in the manuscript. So this can often require additional permissions or approvals, and this needs to be stated because it's coming from a particular source. So for research involving Indigenous communities, additional permissions might need to be sought from community elders or leaders, and a statement should be included to confirm that all necessary permissions have been obtained by the authors for the use and publication of such content. There may also be other types of sensitive images being included, depending on the journal. So it could be photographs, videos, or models of human remains from Indigenous communities, or it could be pornographic or explicit images. And in these types of cases, authors should be careful to include a clear statement in the article to provide a warning about the content. Oh, sorry. Oops, just going back. Sorry, can you still see my slides?
Yep.
Yep. Right, so we've discussed some of the common issues. Now let's take a look at how do we as publishers ensure the integrity of the scholarly record. So where there is a serious flaw and it's been confirmed in an article published by us, we as a publisher have responsibility to correct the scholarly record. As a publisher, we also have a responsibility towards the permanency of the published record. Published content, which means that key scholarly content within articles cannot be silently corrected or removed. Therefore, to notify readers of any changes to the status of an article, we can publish permanent notices which remain linked to the original article. So this ensures where a journal is indexed in one of the major indexes, those post-publication notices also get transported there, and readers can then see there is a linked post-publication notice to that article. And the purpose of these are to correct the scholarly record to ensure its integrity. The notices themselves should not be used to point fingers or apportion blame or absolve anyone. And so the language within these notices are meant to be factual, to simply state what the nature of the issue is. At Taylor & Francis, we have 4 options when it comes to these notices. We have a correction, a retraction, an expression of concern, and a removal notice. So what do all of these mean? Firstly, a correction notice is issued to correct minor errors only. So these are errors that do not impact the overall integrity of the article, and so the article's findings remain valid. And that's the key point here. Corrections are where the article findings are still valid. The next option is an expression of concern. And this is where the investigation outcome is inconclusive, or where it's likely to take some time to fully investigate, but the seriousness and the nature of the concern requires a public statement in the meantime. So we would always consider this very carefully, based on the exact nature of the problems and when would be the right timing. And it would always be done in consultation with editors and authors. And this is because they are permanent notices still, like retractions, which is our next option. So a retraction notice is where there has been a serious breach of publication or research ethics, and we have evidence of that, and it's been confirmed. So, for example, where there's been duplicate publication or where the findings of the article have been deemed unreliable. So essentially, the article can no longer stand. Where authors or institutions are non-responsive during our investigations, we can still take action to retract an article where we feel, as the publisher, there is enough evidence and concern to stand by that retraction. So although this is not the preferred way, it is a last option that we have, as we don't want the non-responsive parties to, in a way, get away with it or delay what's necessary by simply not responding to us. Authors can also self-flag these kinds of issues and errors and ask for a retraction themselves. For example, where there's been an honest error which has resulted in a fundamental flaw in their findings. This is actually good scholarly behaviour, and we want to acknowledge that. So notices will state where it is the authors who are retracting. And when an article is retracted, the article does not disappear. It remains online with a retracted watermark across each page and is permanently attached to the retraction notice. So let's go and look at some examples now. So the first example here is a correction notice. And what you'll see firstly is the article publication details, followed by a brief description of what the correction is. So in this case, it was to correct a table which had a publication error. And the correct table is shown in the notice, and it's also corrected in the article. The reason for publishing this correction notice is, as mentioned before, we can't make silent changes. We need to be clear that the change has been marked, and it is also date stamped. This is important so that if anyone had downloaded or cited an earlier version of this article, there's been at least in a record that the article has been updated since then. Next is an example of an expression of concern. So you'll see firstly who is issuing the expression of concern, which is often the editor and publisher, and then you'll see an explanation for the expression of concern. In this case, there's very serious questions raised around the scientific integrity, and we're explaining that despite contacting the authors to supply information to confirm its integrity, they remain unresponsive. And the main purpose of this expression of concern is in the last sentence, which is to advise readers to interpret the information with caution as we continue to work through the issues. And here you'll see a retraction statement. Again, one of the first things we state is who is retracting. So in this case, it's the editors and publisher. but it could, as I said earlier, be the author who is retracting as well. And what follows is an explanation for why we are retracting the article. So this needs to be fair and factual in tone. So we explain, in this case, there has been concerns about the integrity of the data. We explain that we did approach the authors and they did confirm that there are errors present and they agree to the retraction. So that's why the article has been retracted. Next, you'll see some wording which is standard, where we are clear about what guidelines we're following when we're retracting. So we're following COPE and our own guidelines. And finally, we state the article will remain online to maintain the scholarly record with a digital watermark on each page. So that's retractions. As a final option, we have a removal notice. So these are rare and will only be considered in situations where a retraction won't be sufficient to address the issue. For example, it could be that the content might have defamatory or legal concerns. It could be subject to a court order, or there is a high risk of harm if acted upon, or there's been a breach of privacy. So just having that retracted watermark across the article isn't enough, as the content itself can't remain online and so needs to be removed. However, where we do removals, the record of the article does not disappear completely. If anyone has the citation details or the DOI number, they can still see the article publication details, but the content will have been replaced by the removal notice. So here is an example of a removal notice. And you can see the statement starts with the publication details of the article being removed, followed by who is doing the removing. And in most cases, it is the editor and publisher, followed by a very brief and factual description of the reason for the removal. And in this case, it was for legal reasons. Okay, so we've talked a lot about publication ethics so far. We started going through what we mean by publication ethics, who guides this, the common types of ethical issues we see, and just now, the ways that we as a publisher can ensure the integrity of the scholarly record. So who is really responsible for upholding publication ethics? Well, in short, it is all of us. We are all key stakeholders in the scholarly publishing ecosystem. So authors are responsible for the integrity of their work. Institutions are responsible because the work has been conducted using their resources and under their guidance. And editors are the gatekeepers of this work, deciding what gets published and what doesn't, and so hold that responsibility. Reviewers are tasked and entrusted with helping to assess the quality of the work. And as publishers, we are responsible for disseminating it, providing the systems, and preserving the scholarly record. So we are all collectively responsible for this, and therefore must act collectively to preserve the integrity of the scholarly literature as appropriate. To round off this talk, I'm now going to be sharing some tips on avoiding the sorts of problems you've just heard me speak about, so you'll be able to sail smoothly through the waters of publishing ethics. So the first tip here is on avoiding authorship disputes. So when you start a piece of research or work, we highly recommend that you and any contributors to that work agree on the authorship. So who is going to be listed as an author, who is going to act as the corresponding author, and the order of names. This should be based on the authorship criteria for the journal you're submitting to, and anyone who meets that criteria should be included. Anyone who doesn't, but has still contributed, can be listed under acknowledgements, but if you're naming them, you will need to seek their permission to be named. Also, it's important to make sure whoever is listed as the corresponding author, that they are aware of the additional responsibilities of that role, which includes making sure that all authors agree early on which journal the work is being submitted to, ensuring that all authors agree on any changes in the manuscript, including changes to the authorship list, and ensuring all relevant declarations on funding and competing interests have been stated by their co-authors, as well as themselves. And tip number 2 is on securely storing original data to ensure data integrity. So you as an author should ensure all original data, including images, are clearly labelled and stored in case concerns are raised at a later time. And please be ready to share the files with the journal or the publisher if they ask to see this. For example, during investigations into data or image manipulation. And this can occur after publication. And it's important when sharing any data sets to ensure the anonymity of any participants. For more information, you can refer to our data sharing policies on our Author Services webpage. Tip number 3 is on checking that your work meets the mandatory ethical requirements of the journal. So these are found often in the journal's instructions for authors under editorial policies and include things such as confirmation about the originality, so being transparent where there is possible overlap in your work with previous original sources, and this can include your own previous work. Where there is overlap, please make sure that it is appropriately cited in your manuscript. Also making sure that you are aware of any mandatory data sharing policies and any policies where you should be depositing that work, for example, in PubMed Central, or any policies around registering that work, for example, clinical trial registration. The next tip is to ensure that you include declarations on the ethical conduct of the study, and this includes studies on plants and animals as well as humans. So making sure you are aware of ethical requirements and guidelines for animal research, working with Indigenous communities and cultural sensitivities or restrictions associated with any images, to name but a few examples. And where the study requires ethical approval, you have this approval granted from the appropriate ethics board, or there's been a reason for the waiver of that ethics approval, to please make sure that you include a statement in your manuscript to explain this. And where relevant, you should also ensure that you have included a statement on the informed consent from subjects to participate in the study. And where anyone can be potentially identified, please ensure you have got consent to publish and you keep copies of these forms. All Taylor & Francis journals require a competing interest and funding statement to be included within their manuscript for disclosing potential competing interests. And remember, this does include non-financial competing interests and funding sources as well. Even where there is nothing to declare, authors should still include a statement to confirm this. And then also for acknowledgement section, please ensure that you acknowledge assistance by anyone involved in the study or writing of the paper, but who doesn't qualify for authorship. And if you're including them by name, again, please ensure you have their prior permission to do so. And then tip number 5 is around avoiding plagiarism concerns, which is to make sure that you cite all relevant sources and previous versions and obtain permissions for any reuse. It can be helpful to check your manuscript through a plagiarism checker software, for example, Authenticate or Turnitin, for any unintended text reuse before you submit your paper. Also to ensure that you cite appropriate and balanced and relevant sources, so keeping it to evidence-based, peer-reviewed content wherever possible. And if any full versions exist online or other citable forms, for example, preprints, then please ensure that you have cited these as well. And where you are using verbatim or any word-for-word copying or reuse of that text, please ensure that it's included within full quotation marks as well as being cited. And to ensure you also have obtained the necessary permission from any copyright or license holders for any images, models, etc. that you are using from third parties, and that you have acknowledged that you have this permission in the paper. So those are the 5 main tips to authors. Before I finish, I just wanted to highlight that the purpose of this talk has been to introduce you to some of the main issues that we see in publishing ethics. And I appreciate it is a lot to take in all in one go. If you'd like to learn more about any of these topics in your own time, please do visit our Taylor and Francis Editorial Policies webpage, which you can see here. It goes into a lot more detail and includes full explanations as well as links out to other useful resources. So I've included some of these links throughout the slides, and you can also find it on our Author Services website. So that concludes my talk today. Thank you for listening, and I hope it's been useful. If you do have any questions, comments, or feedback, please do feel welcome to use my email address. You can see it here. Or if there are any questions now, I'm happy to take them. And I'll hand over back to Vicky for that.